you interested in gender and disaster?
I'm interested in gender and disaster because, as a male firefighter of 27 years, believe it or not, I'm fortunate to have a privileged job, but that privileged job comes with one detractor, and I think that's the fact that it is male dominated and that there's a fairly low gender mix. So, in my fire service, the fire service I work for, the MFB, we only have 64 female firefighters out of 1,800 or so.
So, what's the problem with that?
Well, I think a greater gender mix would reflect the community that we serve or that we work for. We're public servants, basically. I think that I've been subjected to, not personally, but members of my family and friendship groups certainly have been subjected to sexism and gender bias in the past. And I think that I'm well placed within my role in the MFB to sort of chip away in our organisation and try to enact some organisational change to make us an employer of choice and a public service that is laudable in the scheme of things.
Right. So, Steve, what are the expectations of males at a disaster, and also of women?
The expectations of males and women at a disaster. From my knowledge, now I work in the urban space, so natural disasters en masse happen infrequently in the urban environment, but from my experience, there are definite gender roles and norms that we subscribe to that kick into place based on the expectations over a long period of time. Our fire service is 125 years old. But fires have happened in Australia and across the world for a lot longer than that, obviously. I think there's an expectation that men should do the heavy lifting and that women should do the soft and sort of cuddly stuff away from the scene of an emergency, say, for instance. Natural disaster, which is on a much more grand scale, I think that involves more confusion and less likelihood of people working in unison. And I think that there's a lot to be done to actually challenge what are the expectations or the norms that we accept when it comes to men and women working together in disaster.
So, what have you observed about that intersection of gender and disaster?
My observations about the intersection of gender and disaster come obviously from reading and from anecdotal evidence and conversations I've had with people that are involved in recovery, preparedness and response. Some of the stories that I've heard which directly relate to gender and disaster and how they intersect are to do with survival and the way that men and women survive or perish at times of natural disaster. The thing that sticks in my mind is the difference between the third world or developing countries and what we know of in our developed country in Australia, and that's that men are more likely to die in disaster in Australia or in the first world. Where in third world countries, the carer, the woman basically, who would be caring for the children and the elderly would be more likely to perish. So there's a dichotomy there that is glaring. And when I talk about fatality rates, although I haven't really had any first-hand experience at major natural disaster in this country, that's one of the things that's pointed out very quickly is that men die much more than women do in Australia from natural disaster.
How about the decision making on whether to evacuate or not? How do you see that?
My impressions of how decisions are made at times of disaster on a micro or macro scale, so for a major natural disaster or a household in the urban environment, pretty much centres around the fact that it's the man or the male in a family or in a couple relationship, say for instance, who would make most of these decisions leading up to and at the time of the disaster, the incident. So the decision to go or the decision to stay would generally be made by the male. Or if it's made by a female, there's a good chance that it's going to be overridden by the male based on what their expectations are, their views of masculinity, their role within the family at times when there's not a disaster, when there's not an incident. So I think it's fairly self-evident that based on the stats and the way that people perish, whether or not hold another argument about how messages are received as far as to stay and defend or to leave, but I would suggest that men are the main decision makers when it comes to staying or going.
And there were some dire consequences of that in the 2009 bushfires, weren't there?
Yeah, there were dire consequences as far as the decision making in 2009 at Black Saturday, and from my knowledge, once again, the figures much skewed on the way of men by the way of men dying and perishing, and which would have meant that they either left late or didn't leave at all, because there was an expectation that they should stay and defend their property, because that's what we do. We do as men. We take the heroic route, which doesn't necessarily always translate that way, and in a lot of circumstances would actually put the family, if not the individual, in harm's way.
What happens in the MFB, Steve? What happens to men when gendered issues are not considered, and what happens to women?
Where I work at the Metropolitan Fire Brigade, when gendered issues aren't considered, the effects on men and women are stark. When gendered issues aren't considered, excuse me, when gendered issues aren't considered, the effects on men in my fire service is minimal. Say, for instance, we've had female firefighters since 1988, so for 27 years, I think that is, 25 years. Prior to that, there was no effect, absolutely no effect at all. Gender wasn't even factored in, whether it was around a station or whether it was when we actually acted in anger and went out to calls. I'm sure there were certain considerations, but they certainly weren't enshrined in any sort of policy or training. But now, since 1988, there's been a slow move towards proactive response to affect people more positively, as in men and women, together and separately. We work in a workplace that's unique insofar that we eat, sleep, wash and work there. So there has to be a consideration for gender. We have, as I said before, 64 out of our, almost 4% female firefighters in our workplace. And it's only recently, in the 2000s certainly, mid-2000s, that we've been looking at privacy issues, return to work conditions after maternity leave, say, for instance. So there certainly has been some consideration, but it's only been recently, and it's because of, by sheer weight of numbers, the more females we have in the fire service, the more onus there is on the organisation to actually change things.
So, what about men and women in affected communities? What sort of changes need to be made, and who should make them?
Changes in affected communities to do with gender are really important, because I think the recovery starts at the time of the fire. Now, on a massive scale, like I said, I'm not that privy to major natural disasters in that I work in the city, but the considerations to do with privacy and considerations to do with that are gender specific and child specific, and that allow for the carer and the child, say for instance, to stay connected, have to be considered way before an incident. So there has to be some pre-planning, and I think that the issues to do with safety are always paramount. I mean, our services, emergency response services, have safety at the core, and that shouldn't cease for the sake of, well, at the time of a natural disaster, I should say.
We've heard that some good programs haven't worked on gender in emergency services. What's the alternative?
In 2010, the MFB enacted a Gender Inclusion Action Plan. It's not active at the moment, but I think we've, throughout the course of that period, in the last, say, 4 years, we've been able to instigate certainly some gender-friendly workplace changes, as I said before, in regards to privacy. And uniforms are a huge consideration as well, where once a female firefighter was thrown a male uniform and say, make do with that. I think there may be still sectors or parts of organisations where that still happens, But certainly in the MFB, we've gone in leaps and bounds as far as tailor-made, fitting uniforms and areas for female and male, for what it's worth, to have privacy whenever they get changed and when they clean themselves and when they sleep.
So these actual concrete structural changes have made a bigger difference than run programs, by the sound of it.
Yeah, I think so. I think that you'll always get a little bit of polarisation amongst the men within the fire service when you try to put in policy changes, but when you make some structural changes that benefit both, regardless of gender, benefit all I should say, it's a win for the organisation. It's also a win for the firefighters as well.
One more question. Have you got an example of when lack of to gender had negative consequences or one where it had positive outcomes?
The only negative consequences I would feel that may have existed in the services, emergency response services, are to do with pregnancy. Say, for instance, where a lack of planning, a lack of flexibility, when a female staff member, and for what it's worth, once again, a male staff member may need some extra flexibility in returning to work or caring for children and childcare considerations. Other than that, I think it's not so bad.